Welcome to The Deep Dive. Today we're pulling back the curtain on a story that, well, it spans over 4 decades, crosses continents, and quite remarkably, still holds a global record for the largest ever theft from a government.
That's right. We're talking about the alleged ill-gotten wealth of the Marcos family in the Philippines. And it's a narrative that, despite being decades old, is still very much unfolding.
Absolutely. Our mission in this deep dive is to really explore the complex, often staggering, verifiable amounts tied to this alleged wealth.
We'll trace the decades-long, often painstaking efforts to recover it, look at the big challenges and setbacks along the way.
And then, crucially, see how these historical financial claims connect directly with the Philippines' current economic situation, including its brand new sovereign wealth fund.
Exactly. And to do this, we've gathered quite a range of sources.
We have. We're relying heavily on investigative reports, court documents, rulings from the Philippine Supreme Court and the Sandigan,
economic analyses from places like the Asian Development Bank, official statements, public records. The key here for us is focusing on specific, verifiable figures and what's documented. That's what we're sticking to.
Right. Because understanding these financial flows, it isn't just history. It's vital for public trust, for national development, for the rule of law itself.
Absolutely. Our goal today is to give you a quick but thorough grasp of this incredibly complex topic based on the evidence.
Okay, let's dive in. First up, let's try to get our heads around the sheer scale of this alleged wealth, and importantly, how Philippine law actually defines ill-gotten wealth.
That definition is really the starting point. The Philippine Supreme Court has been quite clear. Ill-gotten wealth refers to assets the Marcoses acquired that go beyond what Ferdinand Marcos legally declared in his official statements of assets and liabilities, the SALNs.
And we need to remember, his legally declared presidential salary was only about, $13,500 US a year?
Precisely. US $13,500. A very specific public figure. So when you compare that baseline to the estimates we're about to discuss, the gap is enormous.
It's not just large, it's astronomical. And the courts have also ruled that this wealth, once proven ill-gotten, is legally forfeited.
Yes, legally deemed forfeited, and specifically earmarked either for compensating human rights victims from that era or for the government itself for public use.
So that legal framework underpins all the recovery efforts.
It's the absolute cornerstone. Now let's talk about the estimates that started emerging, which give us a sense of the staggering scale. Back in the mid-1980s, as the Philippine economy was really struggling.
Right, that context is important.
Very. Ambassador Stephen Bosworth, who was the U.S. ambassador then, reported to the U.S. Congress House Committee on Foreign Affairs in 1985. He estimated around U.S. $10 billion had been stolen in recent years.
$10 billion. And where did that figure come from?
Bosworth actually cited Dr. Bernardo Villegas, an economist from the Center for Research and Communications, CRC, a well-respected Philippine think tank. Villegas himself gave a slightly more conservative, but still huge, minimum figure of U.S. $13.145 billion. And he based that on analyzing import-export data from 1977 to 1985.
$13 billion based on trade figures.
Yes, and he famously said in Filipino, "Kitang-kita ang ebidensya," meaning the evidence is very visible. It suggests it wasn't exactly subtle.
Hard to hide numbers like that, I suppose.
Yeah.
What about after the 1986 revolution? Did the estimates change?
They did. Jovito Salonga, who became the first chair of the Presidential Commission on Good Government, the PCGG, looked at the documents left behind in Malacañang Palace.
Right, the paper trail.
Exactly. Based on that trail, Salonga estimated the range to be between U.S. $5 billion and U.S. $10 billion.
And that's the figure that made headlines globally.
That's the one. That U.S. $5 to $10 billion estimate led Guinness World Records to cite the Marcoses in 1989 for the largest ever theft from a government.
A record they still hold today. Incredible.
It is, and the estimates didn't even stop there. Dr. Jesus Stanislao, also from CRC and later finance secretary, suggested a much higher figure.
Higher than $10 billion?
Potentially, yes. He argued that if you look at the entire 21-year period of Marcos' rule, going back to his time in the legislature in the 50s, then president from the mid-60s, the total could be closer to U.S. $30 billion.
Oh my God.
$30 billion. The sheer range in these estimates is striking in itself.
It really is. And, that variability, that magnitude, it almost became part of the challenge. It made it harder to pin down, harder to prove definitively in court.
Allowed different stories to take root.
Exactly. But while the methodologies and timeframes differ, all these credible estimates point to an immense scale of acquisition, far, far beyond any legitimate means.
Okay, so having established that almost unbelievable scale, the next logical question is, how? How was such a vast fortune allegedly put together? This wasn't just petty corruption, was it?
No, the sources suggest it was a sophisticated, systematic approach, a kind of playbook for plunder, as Jovito Salonga documented.
Let's unpack those techniques of plunder.
Yeah.
Where did the funds allegedly come from initially?
The primary sources identified point to several key areas. Diverted foreign economic aid, for one, money meant for development projects that allegedly got siphoned off.
Okay.
Then there was U.S. government military aid. Apparently, this included large discretionary funds available to Marcos, partly as a thank you for sending Filipino troops to Vietnam.
Interesting. And the third main source?
Kickbacks. Significant kickbacks and commissions from public works contracts stretching over the entire 2 decades of his presidency. It was like draining resources from multiple taps simultaneously.
So a multi-pronged approach.
Yeah.
Now let's get into Salonga's specific techniques.
Right. First, there was the creation of monopolies. Key industries, think coconut, sugar, were put under the control of close associates, his cronies.
And these cronies would then extract profits.
Immense profits, allegedly.
My God.
Controlling the market gave them that power, and a large chunk supposedly flowed back to the Marcoses.
So controlling whole sectors. What else?
Second, the Hest loan. This is a crucial one. These weren't just bad loans. They were loans granted from government banks like PNB or DBP at the behest, the explicit request or command of Marcos, usually to his cronies.
With no proper checks.
Often with little or no proper collateral, due diligence, or adherence to standard banking rules. It was essentially using public funds for private gain under political pressure.
Funneling state money. What about acquiring existing businesses?
That's the third technique, forced takeovers. Profitable businesses, public or private, were allegedly acquired for nominal sums, sometimes practically nothing. Coercion was apparently involved.
So buyouts under duress.
Essentially. And then there was what Salonga called direct raiding of the public treasury and government financial institutions. Just, direct extraction of funds through various means.
And Marcos allegedly used his presidential powers to make this easier.
Absolutely. A fifth method involved issuing presidential decrees. These official orders could grant monopolies, tax breaks, or override laws, all specifically designed to benefit his cronies and facilitate wealth accumulation.
Using the law itself.
Precisely. And alongside that, simply receiving kickbacks and commissions from businesses operating in the Philippines, contractors, foreign investors, anyone needing permits or licenses.
And hiding all this required some complex structures.
Yes. A seventh technique was the extensive use of shell corporations and dummy companies. These were often registered offshore Panama, Switzerland, Hong Kong, creating layers to launder money and hide the real owners.
A maze of corporate entities.
A deliberate maze. And it wasn't just domestic funds. Technique number 8 was skimming foreign aid, diverting parts of international assistance meant for the country.
And finally, the hidden overseas accounts.
The ninth technique, hidden overseas accounts, often using pseudonyms or code names to conceal the wealth. Think William Saunders and Jane Ryan.
Which brings us to a specific and quite recent admission related to this very practice.
It does. In October 2021, IMA Marcos, the president's daughter, admitted using offshore accounts, specifically something called the Sintra Trust, supposedly for her son's education funds.
So an acknowledgement of using these offshore structures.
Exactly. While she framed it legally, it does confirm the family's use of such complex offshore financial mechanisms, which aligns with what the PCGG has alleged for decades.
And just briefly, on the narrative side, Imelda Marcos famously claimed the wealth came from Yamashita's gold, right?
She did, back in 1992. It's a persistent myth about Japanese WWII treasure. But all credible sources and evidence categorize it as unsubstantiated. It's often seen as a way to explain the wealth without admitting illicit origins.
Right. Okay, so that lays out the alleged methods. Now let's pivot to the recovery efforts. This is where the Presidential Commission on Good Government, the PCGG, comes in.
Yes, the PCDG. It was established almost immediately after Marcos fled through Executive Order No. 1 signed by President Corazon Aquino on February 28, 1986.
Just days after the revolution. What was its specific mandate?
Its primary mission was, and still is, the recovery of all that ill-gotten wealth from the Marcoses, their relatives, cronies, associates, both here in the Philippines and overseas, plus investigating other corruption and implementing preventative measures. It's a quasi-judicial body.
And crucially, where is the recovered money supposed to go? Is it just general government funds?
Not exactly. Since 1998, there's a law, the Comprehensive Agrarian Reform Law, which states that PCGG recovered funds are automatically appropriated for the Philippines Agrarian Reform Program. Automatically appropriated for the Philippines Agrarian Reform Programs.
So directly funding land reform for farmers.
Yes, and it's significant. These funds have consistently covered over 80% of that entire budget. Billions have gone to that.
That's a major impact. Any other specific allocations?
There is the Human Rights Victims Reparation and Recognition Act of 2013. This law specifically allocated $10 billion, about US $200 million then, from certain recovered funds.
Which funds specifically?
Specifically, funds ordered returned by the Swiss Federal Supreme Court in 1997, a decision later confirmed by the Philippine Supreme Court in 2003. That euro billion was designated solely for compensating victims of human rights violations during the martial law era.
So a clear link between recovery and justice or redress.
A very clear legal link. It shows the intent behind the recovery efforts.
Okay, let's trace the actual recovery amounts. How did it start? I remember hearing about something called Operation Big Bird.
Ah, yes, Operation Big Bird. That was the dramatic early attempt in 1986, led by Salonga and others. They aimed to quickly recover funds from Swiss banks using documents found in Malacañang.
Do they have an idea of how much was there?
They identified potentially US $7 billion in various accounts. Initially, they had some success. They managed to transfer a verifiable US $356 million back to the Philippine government.
But there was a setback.
A major one. Marcos, from Hawaii, revoked his power of attorney over the funds. This led the Swiss Attorney General to freeze the remaining accounts, demanding formal proof of ownership from the Philippines through its courts before releasing anything more.
So the legal hurdles appeared immediately. How did the recovery progress after that initial push?
Slowly, painstakingly. By 1998, the amount recovered just from those Swiss accounts had grown to US $570 million. This was transferred to an escrow account at the Philippine National Bank.
And then came a crucial court decision.
Yes, 2003. The Philippine Supreme Court finally declared that money public funds earmarked for agriculture and agrarian reform. A landmark ruling.
But wasn't there some controversy even with those recovered funds?
Unfortunately, yes. Sources note that a portion of those very funds, meant for farmers, was allegedly diverted into the 2004 fertilizer fund scam, a major corruption scandal during the Arroyo presidency.
So even recovered wealth wasn't safe.
Yeah.
A sobering point.
It really is. It shows the persistence of corruption risks. But despite that, Switzerland did finally release the total amount, US $683 million, directly to the Philippine Treasury in 2004. That's a confirmed, verifiable figure from central bank records.
$683 million finally returned. What about the overall total recovered by the PCGG more recently?
According to public records, by 2019, the PCGG reported recovering over $171 billion since 1986. That's roughly US $3.4 billion at the time.
And that figure grew slightly.
Yes, by the end of 2020, the total recovered hit $174.2 billion. The detailed remittances to the Treasury were around $171.3 billion, benefiting agrarian reform, human rights victims, and covering operational costs.
Was there other money recovered, maybe not directly remitted yet?
Yes. There was also about $46.5 billion from a compromise deal involving shares in Meralco, the electric company. These were Lopez family shares allegedly acquired by Marcos using sinister strategies, as the documents say.
Well, interestingly, the government's own Commission on Audit, COA, flagged something about those Meralco funds.
They did. In 2019, COA called out Malacañang, the presidential office, for not utilizing those substantial proceeds, even though they could fund development projects. It suggested bureaucratic holdups or lack of political will.
So the recovery effort is still very much ongoing.
Absolutely. As of late 2021, there was still $2.88 billion in an escrow fund untouched. The PCGG was actively pursuing another under $25.9 billion in alleged ill-gotten wealth. That's over 1,800 items, real estate, personal property.
And physical assets still to be sold off.
Right. Another $54.7 billion worth of assets, properties, stocks, jewelry, art were pending privatization, meaning sale by the PCGG.
It sounds like a monumental task just keeping track of it all.
It is. And interestingly, the PCGG has actually been criticized, even chided publicly by a Sandigan Bayan justice for not maintaining clear, updated accounts of exactly what remains to be recovered. It highlights the sheer complexity over nearly 4 decades.
Which brings us to some specific verifiable court-ordered forfeitures. These aren't estimates. These are amounts confirmed by courts as ill-gotten.
These are crucial because they represent definitive legal victories based on evidence. The big one was in 2003. The Supreme Court ordered the forfeiture of U.S. $658 million from those frozen Swiss bank accounts we discussed.
That was the bolt of the Swiss money.
Yes. Then in 2012, the Supreme Court affirmed the forfeiture of assets held by Aroma Inc., confirmed as a Marcos dummy company. That account started with U.S. $2 million in 1972.
And grew substantially.
Massively. It ballooned to around U.S. $35 million by 2000, and then reportedly U.S. $42 million by 2014, shows how hidden wealth can multiply. The initial forfeiture was for $3.3 million, but the growth illustrates the scale.
That growth is staggering. Any other major specific forfeitures?
Yes, relatively recently, September 2021. The Sandigan Bayan awarded the PCGG bank certificates held by Royal Traders Holding Co. These were valued at $96 million, plus U.S. $5.4 million, plus 12% annual interest since 1993.
So with interest, that's a significant amount now.
Estimates put the total award with interest somewhere between $1 billion and $1.65 billion. A very substantial recovery.
Wow. What about non-cash assets, like art?
In 2019, the Sandigan Bayan ordered the forfeiture of a collection of paintings and art valued at U.S. $24.3 million. This included famous pieces like a Botticelli Madonna and Child.
And even property within the Philippines.
Most recently, in 2024, the Supreme Court ruled that a large 57.68 hectare property in Paoe, Ilocos Norte, linked to the family, was ill-gotten and ordered it returned to the state.
These verifiable court decisions are critical pieces of the puzzle.
Absolutely. They move beyond estimates to concrete legal findings. Now, besides the numbers, there's the tangible evidence, the physical stuff that was identified or seized. Let's talk about those assets.
Right, the physical manifestations of the alleged wealth. The overseas real estate is a major category. We know about significant investments in the U.S., Imelda's famous New York building purchases, like 40 Wall Street, the Crown Building.
And states in New Jersey, too, right, for the children?
Yes, estates in New Jersey, Jose Ocampo's investments in Seattle, properties in Hawaii, including their exile home, even ownership of the California Overseas Bank in L.A.
Yes. And the network extended beyond the U.S. Oh, definitely. Sources mention gold and diamond investments in South Africa, banks and hotels in Israel, land in Austria, the UK, Italy. A truly global portfolio.
And how were these typically held? Not directly in their names.
Often not. Usually under the names of cronies, like Jose Ocampo's. He later cooperated and revealed the incredibly complex structures interlocking shell corporations designed specifically to hide the true ownership. His testimony was key.
A deliberate effort to obscure. What about properties within the Philippines? The famous Marcos mansions.
There were around 50 such properties identified. Lavish homes scattered across the country, Baguio, the Ilocos region, Leyte, which is Imelda's home province, and all over Greater Manila.
Were they all owned directly?
Some were titled to the family, yes, but many others were found to be titled to cronies, yet exclusively reserved for the Marcos family's use, like several mansions on Outlook Drive in Baguio, one apparently for each family member. Many were sequestered right after 1986.
Turned into government property, and then, of course, the Marcos jewels. They become almost symbolic.
Highly symbolic. 3 distinct sets were sequestered by the PCGG in '86.
Did you break those down?
Sure. There's the Hawaii collection, seized by U.S. Customs when they landed in exile. Then the Malacañang collection, found left behind in the palace after they fled, reportedly just abandoned in closets. And the Remelios collection, confiscated from an associate, Dimitri Remelios, trying to smuggle them out of Manila airport that same night.
And these were eventually valued?
Yes. After years in vaults, in 2016, the government announced they'd been appraised at around $1 billion, which is about U.S. $21 million then. They were slated for auction to convert them into public funds. And
legally confirmed as ill-gotten.
The Malacañang collection specifically was ruled ill-gotten by the Sandigan Bayan in 2014, and the Supreme Court affirmed that forfeiture in 2017.
Okay, finally in this section, the overseas bank accounts. A primary tool for hiding wealth, it seems.
Absolutely central. Much of the wealth PCGG pursued was hidden this way, often uncovered through documents left in the palace. Marcos Sr. opened his first known overseas account back in July 1967 at Chase Manhattan in New York with U.S. $215,000.
Relatively early in his presidency. But the most famous are the Swiss accounts.
The William Saunders and Jane Ryan accounts, yes.
God.
4 accounts opened at Credit Suisse in Zurich in March 1968 using those aliases. The initial deposit across those 4 was U.S. $950,000.
A significant amount back then, hidden behind fake names. What happened to those accounts after 86?
The Swiss government froze them immediately. Then came years of legal battles. In 1990, the Swiss Federal Supreme Court said the funds could be returned, but only after a final ruling from a Philippine court confirming they were illicit.
Which eventually happened.
Yes. By 1997, the Swiss court went further, confirming the funds were of criminal provenance and allowing transfer to an escrow account in Manila. This led directly to the Philippine Supreme Court's 2003 confiscation ruling.
And the final transfer we mentioned earlier.
Exactly, resulting in that U.S. $683 million being returned to the Philippine Treasury in 2004. A very clear documented trail for that portion.
What about the Aroma account? That also comes up often.
The Aroma account is another key one, opened in 1972 at Merrill Lynch in New York. Under the Aroma Foundation, a Panamanian entity later proven to be a Marcos dummy. Started with U.S. $2 million.
And grew to.
Around U.S. $35 million by 2000, maybe U.S. $42 million by 2014. Again, illustrating that compounding effect.
God.
The Supreme Court affirmed its forfeiture in 2012.
Are there other accounts recovered through different means?
Yes, the PCG had some early successes through compromise deals struck with Imelda or various cronies. These involved funds in banks like Sanwa Bank in Japan, Redwood Bank, and California Overseas Bank in the U.S., so a mix of legal battles and negotiations.
It's clear, then, that substantial verifiable assets were identified, and many legally confirmed as ill-gotten. Yeah. But the fight isn't over. Let's get into the ongoing battle, the denials, the recent wave of case dismissals, the legal setbacks. This feels very current.
It is very current, and this is where the historical narrative really clashes with present-day politics. President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. has consistently denied his family possesses ill-gotten wealth. He often calls the accusations propaganda.
He's been quite explicit about this recently.
Yes. In an interview in March 2024, he claimed the government cases against his family and the estate had failed, that the assertions were shown to be untrue. He even repeated the claim that the family left empty-handed in 1986.
Which, as we mentioned, contradicts the documented evidence from their arrival in Hawaii.
Directly contradicts it. Records show they brought crates of cash, jewelry, those millions in newly printed pesos, and significantly, nearly $400 million in bank certificates from Traders Royal Bank.
Which were later ruled ill-gotten by the Sandigan Bayan in 2021.
Precisely. Those specific certificates were ordered returned. Plus, the PCGG found extensive documentary evidence diaries, ledgers, Swiss account details right after 1986. The evidence is substantial.
This makes the recent trend of case dismissals particularly striking.
Yeah.
You mentioned cases flying out the window.
That's the phrase some observers have used. It's a significant trend, particularly noticeable since Marcos Jr. took office in June 2022. For instance, October 4, 2024, the Sandigan Bayan dismissed a civil case against Marcos Jr. and Imelda involving 12 properties worth $276 million.
And the reason given?
Inordinate delay in prosecution. That was reportedly the 7th such dismissal under the current administration.
7th. That does suggest a pattern. Were there similar dismissals before his term?
Yes, the trend wasn't entirely new, but it seems to have accelerated. Back in December 2019, a huge $200 billion civil forfeiture case was dismissed because the prosecution apparently couldn't prove the allegations adequately with admissible evidence.
Evidence issues seem common.
They do. June 2023, another case dismissed because the PCGG's evidence was deemed inadmissible. In February 2024, charges against 3 alleged dummies involving $2.4 billion in properties were also thrown out.
What are the specific legal reasons the courts are citing for these dismissals, beyond just delay?
Often it's the constitutional right to a speedy disposition of cases. After 30-plus years, the delay itself is seen as prejudicial to the defendant's cost of defense, bail restrictions.
And the passage of time affects evidence and witnesses. Exactly.
Courts note witnesses may have died, memories faded, documents lost or degraded. It becomes harder to ensure a fair trial. And Imelda Marcos' age, now 95, has been explicitly mentioned as impacting her ability to participate effectively in her defense.
How have activist groups reacted to this spate of dismissals?
Groups like Aroma, the campaign against the return of the Marcoses and martial law, have been very vocal. They call it a denial of justice. They directly accuse Marcos Jr. of using his power to remove legal obstacles to his family, potentially recovering assets.
They see it as a deliberate whitewashing effort.
They frame it as a slew of injustices, a clear pattern aimed at revising history and undermining accountability for dictatorship-era crimes.
It's important, though, to balance this with the fact that there were significant convictions before this recent trend, right?
Absolutely crucial point. Despite these dismissals, we have verifiable rulings that stand. Imelda Marcos' 2018 conviction by the Sandigan in 7 criminal cases, carrying a potential sentence up to 77 years, that's on record, even if appeals are ongoing or bail was granted.
Though she was acquitted in some other cases earlier.
Right. An earlier acquittal on dollar salting charges was affirmed in 2018 due to insufficient proof of intent. But the 2018 convictions on different charges remain significant. And crucially, we also have the earlier U.S. court rulings from 1986 and the Swiss Federal Supreme Court rulings from 1990 confirming the ill-gotten nature of assets, which were foundational for recovery. Those haven't been overturned.
Okay. Now let's zoom out. How does all this history connect with the Philippines' current national economic landscape, and particularly this new Maharlika Investment Fund, the Miff?
Well, the economic backdrop is quite interesting. The Asian Development Bank's April 2025 report paints a fairly positive picture for the Philippines, actually.
Positive how?
Projected GDP growth is strong, 6.0% in 2025, 6.1% in 2026, up from 5.6% in 2024. It remains one of Southeast Asia's fastest-growing economies.
And inflation, is that under control?
Forecasts suggest it will stay within the government's target range, around 3.0% for both 2025 and 2026, mainly due to stable global commodity prices and, importantly, slowing rice inflation.
What's driving the growth?
Strong domestic demand is key consumer spending, government investment in social services, and infrastructure. Plus, rising employment, the jobless rate is relatively low, jobs are being created, household incomes are up thanks to wage hikes and remittances. Election spending for the midterms probably gives a boost too.
And the investment side looks okay.
The government's been easing foreign ownership rules in key sectors like energy, telecoms, transport, hoping to attract more investment. Public spending is also up, with a nearly 10% budget increase for 2025, a big chunk for social services, and continued high infrastructure spending 5 to 6% of GDP on major projects.
But there are risks.
Always. Global trade uncertainties like U.S. tariffs, geopolitical tensions, and the ever-present risk of weather shocks affecting agriculture.
So into this context comes the Maharlika Investment Fund, the Miff, the country's first sovereign wealth fund.
Yes, proposed in late 2022, notably by lawmakers, including the president's son and cousin, and signed into law pretty quickly, July 2023.
What's its stated goal?
Officially, it's to generate long-term investment capital for economic growth and job creation. NEDA projects maybe 350,000 jobs. It's meant to fund things like agriculture, climate resilience, digitalization, energy, infrastructure.
And the funding. Where does the initial money come from? Verifiable sources.
The initial seed fund is set at $500 billion, about US $9 billion. The verifiable sources are dividends from the national government itself, plus 2 state-owned banks, the Land Bank and the Development Bank of the Philippines.
And the central bank contributes too.
Yes, the Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas is contributing 100% of its dividends for the first 2 years. Crucially, initial plans to use pension funds, GSIS, and SSS were blocked by public outcry and legislative changes. So, no direct investment from pensions is allowed.
But maybe indirect investment.
That's a concern raised that they could potentially invest via third parties, creating indirect exposure.
What's the MIF's investment strategy? Where will it put this money?
Plans include investing in foreign currencies, domestic and foreign corporate bonds, real estate, infrastructure projects, a fairly broad mix, potentially global.
But isn't it unusual for a country with a budget deficit to start a sovereign wealth fund? Usually they come from surpluses, right?
That's a major point of criticism. Sovereign wealth funds typically come from surplus revenues, oil money, trade surpluses. The Philippines operates with a severe deficit, as critics point out. So the MIF isn't funded by genuine excess capital, raising questions about where the seed money is truly coming from, potentially diverted funds, or even borrowing.
Which leads directly into the risks and criticisms surrounding the MIF.
Exactly. The number one concern, voiced even by Senator IMA Marcos, is the risk of mismanagement and graft. The comparison to Malaysia's 1MDB scandal comes up frequently.
Where billions were lost from a similar state fund.
Precisely. The governance structure here raises eyebrows a 9-member board appointed by the president, including the finance secretary. While there are penalties for misuse written into the law, Enforcement is the question, given the history in the Philippines of powerful figures avoiding accountability.
And the political influence aspect.
Despite claims of depoliticization, the fact that the president's son and cousin were key proponents, and the legislature is largely aligned with him, fuels skepticism about its independence.
Senator Hontiveros called it a liability fund.
Yes, arguing it risks increasing foreign debt rather than generating wealth, given the deficit situation. And using assets from Land Bank and DBP, which are crucial development banks, is seen as potentially risky for the overall banking system stability.
This ties into a broader historical context in the Philippines, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. The Miff faces a huge challenge, overcoming a long history of chronic mismanagement and corruption in major government programs. Think about the issues with Duterte's build, the massive debt still being paid from Marcos Sr.'s era projects, the 2013 pork barrel scandal under Aquino III involving ghost projects.
So a persistent pattern across different administrations.
Yes, this history of endemic corruption and mismanagement creates deep public skepticism about whether a fund like the Miff can truly be effective and avoid the same pitfalls. Failure could seriously undermine public trust even further.
Finally, let's touch on the battle for truth, the role of disinformation in shaping how this history is perceived today.
This is a critical and frankly quite worrying aspect. Studies have shown that denying the Marcos kleptocracy is a central theme in organized networked propaganda campaigns online.
Propagating specific false narratives.
Yes, things like the Solano gold or Yamashita treasure myths to explain the wealth legitimately. Or the flatly untrue claim that Imelda Marcos won every corruption case, ignoring the verifiable convictions and forfeitures.
And these aren't just fringe theories.
No, they're pushed by influential social media personalities, Facebook pages, YouTube channels, even political figures, like former President Duterte making claims about the family planning to give away wealth without acknowledging illegal cases, lend these narratives undeserved weight. Marcos family members themselves sometimes amplify these points.
What's the overall impact of this disinformation?
It's profound. It fuels historical distortion, rewriting the past for many, especially younger Filipinos. It also breeds disillusionment with democracy itself. When people see corruption cases drag on or get dismissed, they lose faith.
Which can lead to favoring stronger, less democratic leadership.
Tragically, yes. Cynicism about democratic institutions can make authoritarianism seem appealing. It fundamentally undermines efforts for accountability, justice, and learning from history.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, we've really covered a lot of ground. We've journeyed through the decades-long saga of the alleged Marcos ill-gotten wealth.
Looking at the staggering estimates, the specific verifiable amounts recovered through painstaking legal battles, the types of assets involved from Swiss banks to real estate to jewels.
And the persistent challenges, the ongoing denials, the recent legal setbacks, and this pervasive cloud of disinformation that seeks to obscure the facts.
And we've connected this heavy historical legacy directly to the present, to initiatives like the Maharlika Investment Fund and the country's current economic path. The past isn't just past, it's actively shaping the present and future.
Which leaves us, and you, our listener, with a pretty significant question to ponder. In a world saturated with information, but also disinformation, how can we ensure that historical financial injustices like these are truly reckoned with?
And how do we make sure that today's economic policies like the Miff actually build trust and serve the public good, especially when distinguishing documented fact from persistent, often politically motivated narratives is so challenging?
What responsibility do we all share as citizens trying to stay informed to actively seek out and defend those verifiable truths, especially when there are powerful forces working to bury them?
Some important things to think about. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into a complex intersection of history, wealth, and national finance.